and stuff like that afterwards. Here we go. Page 99. 2. Law of unification and contradictions between opposites. The law of unification and contradictions between opposites is the essence of dialectics. According to Lenin, quote, in brief, dialectics can be defined as the doctrine of unity of opposites. This embodies the essence of dialectics, but it requires explanations and development. According to the law of unification and contradictions between opposites and fundamental originating the universal driving force of all motion and development processes is the inherent and objective contradiction which exists in all things, phenomena, and ideas. In other words, contradictions, defined further in the next section, is the force which serves as a fundamental or originating and universal force which drives all motion and development of all things, phenomena, and ideas. Contradiction is a fundamental driving force because it is the most basic driving force which all other forms of motion and development are based upon. Yay. Contradiction is the originating driving force because all motion and development arise from contradictions. Contradiction is the universal driving force because all things, phenomena, and ideas, without exception, are driven to motion and development by contradictions. A. Definition of contradictions and common characteristics of contradictions. It's going to be contradictions every other word, everybody. Just letting you know. Definition of contradiction. In dialectics, the concept of contradictions is used to refer to the relationship, opposition, and transformation between opposites which take place within all things, phenomena, and ideas, as well as between all things, phenomena, and ideas. This dialectical concept of contradictions is fundamentally different from the metaphysical concepts of contradiction. The metaphysical concept of contradiction is an illogical conception of opposition without unity and without dialectical transformation between opposites. A contradiction is fundamentally just a type of relationship. In a contradictory relationship, two things, phenomena, or ideas mutually impact one another, resulting in an eventual negation of one subject and a synthesis of the negator and the negated into some new form. Here we got a picture, Joe. First picture. You there? There we go. Here we go. Metaphysical concepts of contradiction is considered illogical because it establishes no connection between that which is negated and the resulting synthesis. As you can see, there is no relations between, well, there could be, they're both animals, but you have a fox and you have a rabbit, and in there you have the fox. Now let's find out. Metaphysical contradictions, contradicting subjects, are isolated and distinct. Complete negation and one subject by another. Negation ends contradiction once and for all. In the metaphysical conception of contradictions, the negated disappears and is not represented in the resulting synthesis. Metaphysical contradiction presents contradicting subjects as isolated from one another and completely distinct, when in reality the relationship between the negated and the negator essentially defines the contradiction. The negated subject is seen as completely negated. That is to say, it is conceived as essentially disappearing into the synthesized result of the contradiction. In this sense, this metaphysical conception of negation is inaccurate in that it is represented as a complete terminating process. And the above example, once the fox eats the rabbit is considered gone. After the terminal negation process ends the contradiction. Now we have the rabbit, boom. Now I don't know what this is, the infinity sign in the fox. So we're going to find out. Contradictions of materialist dialectics. Contradicting subjects are defined by the relationship. Negated subject impacts negators. Characteristics carried forward. Contradictions and negation. Cycle continues forever. Oh, because that's why the cycle continues forever. Got it. Okay. The materialist dialectical conception of contradictions recognizes that contradicting subjects are defined by the relationship, and that the synthesis of the contradiction carries forward attributes and characteristics from both the negator and the negated. All right, thank you. Materialist dialectical contradictions recognize that every contradiction is defined by the relationship between the negated and the negator. Materialist dialectics also recognizes that attributes and characteristics of the negated subject are carried forward into the synthesized subject. Materialist dialectics also recognizes that contradictions continue indefinitely as the negated becomes the negated. And again, and so on, continuously forever. In the example on the previous page, the fox consumes the rabbit, constitutes a negation process in which the fox takes the characteristics from the rabbit, i.e., nutritional and energy content, any diseases which may be carried forward to the fox, etc. Contradictions arise from opposition, which exist within and between things, phenomena, and ideas. The concept of opposing sides refers to such aspects, properties, and tendencies of motion which opposes one another, yet are simultaneously conditioned and premises of the existence of one another. Examples include negative charge and positive charge within an atom, anabolism and catabolism within living organisms. Anabolism refers to the growth and building up of molecules within an organism, while catabolism refers to the digestion and breakdown of molecules within an organism. Production and consumption, associated economic activities, trial and error, which leads to cognitive development. All of the above forms of contradiction drives motion and development. These processes exist in unity and opposition. For example, in political economics, production is driven by consumption, and consumption is facilitated by production. Even though these are fundamentally opposite forces, production aids to the total quantity of products, while consumption reduces the total quantity of products. We can't exist without they can't exist without one another. They drive each other forward. This is the dialectical nature of contradictions as the driving force of all motion and development, as defined in materialist dialectics. The general properties of contradictions. Contradictions is objective and universal. According to Frederick Engels, quote, if simple mechanical change of position contains a contradiction, this is even more true of the higher forms of motion, of matter, and especially of organic life and its development. We saw above that life consists precisely and primarily in this, that a being is at each moment itself and yet something else. Life is therefore also a contradiction which is present in things and processes themselves, in which constantly originates and resolves itself. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life too comes to an end, and death steps in. We likewise saw that also in the sphere of thought, we could not escape contradictions, and that, for example, contradiction between man's inherently unlimited capacity for knowledge and its actual presence only in men who are externally limited and possess limited cognition finds its solution in what is, at least practically for us, an endless succession of generations and infinite processes. Here, Engels is explaining how contradiction is the driving force of both material and conscious processes of motion and development. The process of life is a process of contradictions. All organic life forms must consume organic matter so that they can produce growth, and offsprings must produce certain molecules and metabolic process so that they can consume nutrients, and so on. Once these contradictory processes stop, Engels says death steps in, though even death is a transition forward. Conscious motion, and development are also rooted in contradictory forces. Engels points out the contradiction between humanity's seemingly infinite capacity for learning with the seemingly infinite amount of knowledge which can be obtained in the world. This great contradiction drives a seemingly endless process of expanding human knowledge collectively over countless generations. Contradictions are not only objective and universal, but also diverse and plentiful. The diverse nature of contradictions is evident in the fact that every subject can include many different contradictions, and that contradictions manifest differently depending upon specific conditions. Contradictions can hold different positions and roles in the existence, motion, and development of things, phenomena, and ideas. These positions and roles include, but are not limited to, internal and external conditions, fundamental and non-fundamental contradictions, primary and secondary contradictions. Eternal contradictions are contradictions which exist in the internal relations of a subject, while external conditions exist between two or more subjects as external relations. For example, a sports team might have internal contradictions between the players and the coach, between the coach and the management, etc. External contradictions might exist between the team and other teams, between the team and the league officials, between the team and the landlords who own the team's practice space, etc. A fundamental contradiction is a contradiction which defines the essence of a relationship. Fundamental contradictions exist throughout the entire development process of a given thing, phenomenon, and idea. A non-fundamental contradiction exists in only one aspect or attributes of a thing, phenomenon, or idea. A non-fundamental contradiction can impact a subject, but it will not control or decide the essential development of the subject. Whether or not a contradiction is fundamental is relative to the point of view. For example, the fundamental contradiction of one nation engaged in war against one other might be the war itself. There will exist many other contradictions. One nation at war might have a trade dispute with a third nation, which is not participating in the war. From the war perspective, this contradiction is non-fundamental, as it does not define the essential characteristics of the nation at war, though from the perspective of a diplomatic charged with ending the trade dispute, the war may seen as non-fundamental contradiction, while the dispute would be seen as fundamental. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? Are we good? Sounds like we're good so far. All right, cool. In the development of things, phenomenons, and idea, there are many development stages. In each stage of development, there will be one contradiction which drives the development process. That is what we call the primary contradiction, which a lot of people don't like, the primary, secondary. Secondary contradictions include only the other contradiction which exists during that stage of development. Determining whether a contradiction is primary or secondary is relative. It depends heavily upon the material conditions and the situation. And even like Mao has talked about on contradiction, how primary and secondary can change up depending on the conditions and what is driving the force of a sharp contradiction. For example, when restoring the old car that doesn't run anymore, a mechanic may consider the primary contradiction to be the non-functioning engine. There may be many secondary contradictions which contribute to the problem with the car's engine problems. The battery may be dead. The spark plugs may need to be bad. May need to be bad. The tires may need replacement. The timing belt may be loose, etc. Those are all secondary contradictions which do not define the stage of development, which is repairing the engine. Some of these secondary contradictions may need to be resolved, such as replacing spark plugs, before the primary contradiction can be fully addressed. Others, such as the cracked windshield, may not need to be addressed before the primary contradiction can be dealt with. On the other hand, a secondary contradiction may become the primary contradiction if a mechanic resolves every problem with the engine except for one bad spark plug, then the bad spark plug will shift from being secondary contradiction to being the primary contradiction. The bad spark plug is now the primary reason the car won't start, and in this stage of development can't be completed. Within all the various fields of inquiry, there exist contradictions which have a diverse range of different properties and characteristics. Different fields of study will focus on different forms of contradictions, and any given thing, phenomenon, or idea may contain countless contradictions, which can be analyzed and considered for different purposes. For example, consider a large city, which might contain far too many contradictions to count. Civil engineers may focus primarily on contradictions on traffic patterns, the structural integrity of bridges and roads, ensuring that buildings are safe and healthy for inhabitants, etc. Utilities department will focus on contradictions related to sewage, electrical, and sanitation systems. The education system will focus on contradictions which prevent students from achieving success in school. All these various methods of analysis may focus on specific forms of contradictions, though there will also be overlap. For instance, designing a school bus system will require the education system and civil engineers to discover and grapple with contradictions which might be hindrance for transporting students safely to school. Motion, process of contradiction. B. In every contradiction, the opposing side are united with each other and opposed to each other at the same time. The concept of unity between opposites referred to fact that a contradiction is a binding, inseparable, and mutual impacting relationship which exists between opposites. Oh, someone's being crappy in the comments, I guess. Ableism. All right. Contradictions are binding and inseparable because they hold a relationship together. If two opposing things, phenomena, and ideas simply separate, then contradiction by definition no longer exists. For example, an economy is bound together by the concentration of production and consumption. If production exists without consumption, or vice versa, it can't be considered to be an economy. Contradictions are said to be mutually impacting because anytime a contradiction exists between two opposing sides, both sides are mutually impacted for as long as the contradiction exists and develops. Of course, it is possible for two opposing sides to separate from one another. For example, a factory which produced buggy wheels. Hold on a second, everybody. Sorry, everybody. The dog was barking for some reason. All right, I'll bring this one up. All right. Buggy whips. may have failed to find consumers after the invention of the car. Thus, there would exist a situation in which production exists without consumption. In this situation, the termination of the contradiction between production and consumption leads to a new contradiction. The factory will now be in the midst of a crisis, which will require it to either provide a different product or go out of business. Thus, we see that production and consumption can't be separated from one another without leading to a change in the essential nature of the relationship and the composing subject. And we see that the opposing sides mutually impact one another. A change in consumption will affect production and vice versa. In any given contradictory relationship, each oppositional side is the premise for the other existence. Unity among opposites also defines an identity of each opposing sides. Lenin wrote, the identity of opposite, it would be more correct perhaps to say their unity, although the difference between the term identity and unity is not particularly important here. In a certain sense, both are correct. Is the recognition, discovery of the contradictory, mutually exclusive opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, include mind and society. Here we go. You're dark. All right, here we go. Here, Lenin is explaining that identity and unity are more or less the same concept when it comes to understanding the nature of contradictions between opposites in material processes of nature, social processes, and processes of consciousness. We perceive and define of oppositional forces by recognizing mutually exclusive and contradictory tendencies within and between things, phenomena, and ideas. In other words, whenever we think of an oppositional relationship, we define it in terms of opposition, war, opposing sides, disease, human body versus pathogens, economy, production versus consumption. Contradictory relationships are defined and unified by opposition. War, disease, and economy are all examples of unity of contradictions. Thank you. Oh wait, I gotta do me, right? There we go. Okay. When we think of war, we think of the contradiction which exists between the opposing nation. When we think of disease, we define it by the oppositional force between the ailment of the human body. When we think of economy, we think of oppositional forces of production and consumption within the economy. In other words, the identity of contradictory relationships is defined by the unity of opposing sides with one another. The concept struggle of opposites refers to the tendency of opposites to eliminate and negate each other. There exist many diverse forms of struggle between opposites. Struggles can manifest in various forms based on a nature of a given thing, phenomenon, or idea, relationships within a thing, phenomenon, and idea, or between things, phenomena, and ideas. Specific material conditions. The process of unity and struggle of opposites inevitably leads to the transformation between them. The transformation between opposites takes place with rich diversity, and such transformation can vary depending on the properties of the opposite sides as well as specific material conditions. Opposing sides, by definition, oppose one another. If forces are or characteristics which exist within or between things, phenomena, or ideas do not oppose one another, then they are not, by definition, opposites. Thus, it can be understood that opposing sides have a tendency to struggle against one another. It is this very struggle which defines two sides as opposites and as contradictory. Lenin explains that some contradicting opposite sides can exist in what he describes as equilibrium. But that this is only ever temporary state of affairs, as exemplified in his article an equilibrium of force. Clearly, Lenin sees that this equilibrium of contradictory forces is not permanently sustainable. Indeed, no equilibrium of contradictory forces can be permanent. Eventually, one opposing side will overtake the other, and eventually, any given contradiction will result in one opposing side overcoming the other. According to the law of unification and contradictions between opposites, the struggle between two opposing sides is absolute, while the unity between them is relative, conditional, and temporary. In the unity, there is a struggle in unity. According to Lenin, the unity coincides identity, equal action of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, so as development and motion are absolute. Absolute and relative are philosophical classifications which refer to interdependence, that which is absolute exists independently and with permanence. That which is relative is temporary and dependent on other conditions or circumstances in order to exist. So Lenin's point is the unity exists temporarily in any given pair of opposing sides, as the unity only exists as long as the opposing sides are opposing one another. As soon as one side eliminates or negates the other, the unity subsides. However, opposition is considered absolute because it is opposition which drives motion and change in all things, phenomenons, and ideas, contradictory processes of opposing sides. In the same text quoted in the message above on questions of dialectics, Lenin notes the distinction between subjectivism, skepticism, sophistry, etc., and dialectics, incidentally, is that in objective dialectics, the difference between the relative and the absolute is itself relative. For objective dialectics, there is an absolute within the relative. For subjectivism and sophistry, the relative is only relative and excludes the absolute. Such must also be the method of exposition, i.e. study, of dialectics in general. To begin with, what is the simplest, most ordinary, common, etc., with any proposition? The leaves of a tree are green. John is a man. Fido is a dog, etc. Here already we have dialectics, as Hegel's genius recognized. The individual is the universal. The universal exists only in connection that leads to the universal. The universal exists only in the individual and through the individual. Every individual is, in one way or another, a universal. Every universal is a fragment or an aspect or the essence of an individual. Every universal only proximately embraces all the individual objects. Every individual enters incompletely into the universal, etc., etc. Every individual is connected by thousands of transitions with other kinds of individuals, things, phenomena, and processes, etc. Here already we have the element, the germs, the concepts of necessity, of objective connections in nature, etc. Here already we have the contingent and the necessary, the phenomenon and the essence. For when we say John is a man, Fido is a dog, this is a leaf of a tree, etc., we disregard a number of attributes as contingent. We separate the essence from the appearance and counterpose the one to the other. In other words, what does he say? But they won't work hard working jobs. Why does every wannabe communist depict a picture of hardworking? Okay, sure. All right. In other words, we must understand that in materialist dialectics, the absolute and the relative exist within one another. In other words, the absolute and the relative have a dialectical relationship with one another in all things, phenomenons, and ideas. Relative unity refers to the nature of unity between contradictory subjects. Contradictory subjects are unified in the sense that any given contradictions is essentially defined by the contradiction between two subjects. Thus, the two subjects are unified in contradiction. However, this unity is relative in the sense that this unification is temporary. The unity will end upon negation and synthesis and relative, i.e. defined by the relationship between two contradictory subjects. Hold on here. Yep. You could give up your iPhone and work. I don't have an iPhone. Okay, let's bring this up. Don't have an iPhone. Absolute struggle refers to the fact that contradictions, negation, and synthesis will go on forever. In this sense, contradictory processes are absolute because such struggle exists permanently. Struggles has no set beginning or end point and exists independently of any specific thing, phenomenon, idea. Let's try it. So we got A to B negates to C. C to D negates E. E and F negates infinity. Relative unity. Relationships define contradictions are temporary and relative. Absolute struggle. Development through contradiction and permanent and consistent. Relative unity refers to the temporary and relative nature of specific relationships which define and unify specific contradictions. Absolute struggle refers to the permanent, constant nature of development through contradictions. A and B, unity, relative unity. The struggle is infinite, it looks like. Dialectical relations between relative unity and absolute struggle. The relationship between unity, relative unity, and absolute struggle defines and drives change, motion, and development through contradictions. This applies to the contradictions that relative unity and absolute struggle between opposing sides have a dialectical relationship with one another. The permanent absoluteness of struggle, the fact that all things, phenomenons, and ideas are constantly undergoing processes of change through contradictory forces, can only manifest in the relative unity of opposite sides, which can only exist through the temporary existence of conditional relations between opposing sides. Thank you. The interactions that lead to the transformation between opposites is a process. At the beginning, contradictions manifest as differences and then develop into two opposing sides. When the two contradictions are fiercely matched, and when the contradictions are ripe, they will transform each other, and finally, the conflict will be resolved. As old contradictions disappear, new contradictions are formed, and the process of mutual impact, transformation between opposite continues, which drives the motion and development of all things, phenomenons, and ideas. The relationship, impact, transformation between opposites are the source and driving force of all movement and development in the world. Lenin affirms development is the struggle of opposites. Any given process of development, that is to say, of transformation or motion, can be seen as a struggle between opposites. Various forms of struggle can exist simultaneously for any given subject, and the way we interpret struggle can depend on our point of view. For an engineer, a car moving along a road might be seen as a struggle between the power generated by the engine against the mass of the car itself and the friction of the tires on the ground. The driver of the car might see the process in terms of the struggle between the driver and the environment as they navigate across town, avoiding accidents and following traffic laws. In organisms, life can be seen as the struggle between the organism's life process and its environment, or it might be seen as a struggle of contradictory forces within the organism itself, i.e., forces the consumption of nutrition versus forces of expending energy to serve forces of disease versus forces of organism's immune system, etc. Materialist dialectics requires us to identify, examine, and understand the opposing forces which drive all development in our universe. Only through understanding such contradictions can we intercede and effect change in the world which suits our purposes. For example, in order to fight against capitalism, the other forms of oppression, we must first understand the contradictory forces which exist within and between those oppressive social structures. Only then can we determine how we might best apply our will through labor processes to dismantle such oppressive structures. We might do this by exacerbating existing contradictions within oppressive structures, by introducing new contradictions, by negating contradictions which inhabit our own processes, etc. Meaning and methodology. Good on paper. Always the good on paper thing, isn't it? Given that contradictions are objective and universal, and that they are the source and driving force of movement and development, it is therefore necessary to detect, recognize, and understand contradictions, to fully analyze opposing sides, and to grasp the nature, origin, and tendency of motion and development in our awareness and practice. Lenin said, the splitting of a single whole and the cognition of its contradictory parts is the essence of dialectics. In other words, materialist dialectics is simply a system of understanding the world around us by viewing all things, phenomena, and ideas as collections of relationships and contradictions which exist within and between all things, phenomena, and ideas. Since contradictions exist with such rich diversity, it is necessary to have a historical point of view. That is, to know how to analyze each specific type of contradiction and have appropriate methods to resolving them. In our perception and practice, it is necessary to properly distinguish the roles and positions of different types of contradictions in each situation and condition. We must also distinguish between different characteristics which contradiction might have in order to find the best method of resolving them. The historical viewpoint is vital because in order to fully understand any given contradiction, you must understand the process of development which led to its formation. For example, before a car engine can be repaired, we must first find out what caused the engine to stop working to begin with. If the car is out of fuel, we must determine what caused it to run out of fuel. Did the driver simply drive until the fuel tank was empty? Or is there a hole or leak in the fuel line, in the tank, etc.? It is vital to know the history of development of the given pair of opposites side as well as the characteristics of other properties of both opposing sides to fully understand the contradictions. Since all conscious activity will, like all process of motion and change, ultimately derives from the driving force of contradiction, it is vital for us to develop a historical and comprehensive perspective of any contradiction we hope to effect through our conscious activity. Number 3, law of negation of negation. The law of negation describes the fundamental. Are we okay on the contradiction thing? I'm assuming we're good. We're about to go into the law of negation of negation. Right, no one's answered, so we're good, I guess. I'll keep going. You're a bit confused. It is confusing a little bit, yeah? The law of the negation of the negation. The law of the negation of the negation describes the fundamental and universal tendency of movement and development to occur through dialectical negation, forming a psych, psych, synclic, I can't say that word. Cyclinical? How do you say it? How do you say it? Do you know how to say it, Joe? Cyclin? Cyclinical? Cyclinical? Are you there, Joe? Can you say it? Are you able to say it? You're not able to say it. Okay. Hold on a second. Right back. Cyclical. Cyclical. Okay. Let's reread it. Cyclical. The law of the negation of the negation describes the fundamental and universal tendency of movement and development to occur through dialectical negation, forming a oh my gosh, I can't. God damn it. Hold on. Cyclical form of development through what is termed negation of the negation. A. Definition of the negation of dialectical negation. Cyclic. Thank you. The world continuously and endlessly changes and develops. Things, phenomenons, and ideas that arise, exist, develop, and perish are replaced by other things, phenomenons, and ideas. One form of existence is replaced with another form of existence, again and again, continuously through this development process. This procedure is called negation. All processes of movement and development take place through negation. From certain perspectives, negation can be seen as an endpoint, as endpoints to the development and thus existence of a given thing, phenomenon, or idea, which we can think of a terminal negation. But from other perspectives, negation can also create the conditions and premises for new development. Such negation, which create such conditions as premises for the development of things, phenomenons, and are called dialectical negation. Now, I think that's an extra word because, like, if the original text is negation of negation, negation refers to any act of motion or transformation which arise from contradictions. Specifically, negation is what occurs when one opposing side completely overcomes the other. Nothing in our universe can transform or move all by itself without any contradictions. Thus, negation drives all development and motion of all things, phenomenons, and ideas. These are various forms of negation, and the same negation process may be seen to take different forms depending on viewpoint of analysis. Let's see the diagram. Let's see what we can do here. So you have stage of development A, point of view A. All right, terminal negation. All right, cool. So we go B. So replacement negation is B, and then qualitative shift negates C. Dialectic negation is a continuing all the time. So there's the viewpoint of A, the end of development of A, terminal negation. So A is no longer in existence, B is the next. I'm guessing. See, this is hard. No, we're not all alone on this. Everybody's not alone on this. Dialectical negation occurs when the end of development leads directly. There's another picture, Joe. The pew pew weapons. Oh, yeah, I understand now. Lead directly to some new development process. Dialectical negation occurs through qualitative shift. which themselves occur through negation of opposite sides. So you have swords are replaced by firearms. That's the negation. Replacement, negation perspective of military weapons. Replacing negation refers to the replacement of one thing, phenomenon, or idea with another through dialectical negation. So like the weapon, the swords going into weapons. All right. Okay. Translation notes the term terminal negation and replacement negation do not appear in the original Vietnamese text. We chose to assign terms of these. Okay. Replacement negation occurs when one thing, phenomenon, or idea takes the place of another. Replacement negation is always a dialectical process where one subject is replacing gradually by another. Replacement may be relatively fast or slow, but it is a never instantiacious. I can't say this word. Instantaneous. Okay, cool. A subject is replaced gradually by another, replaced by the relative fast or slow, but is never instantaneous. Nothing can pop in and out of existence instantaneously. For example, swords were gradually replaced by firearms as a primary weapon of war over the course of many centuries. Today, swords have been completely replaced by firearms on the battlefield. This was the process of replacement negation. Weapons are still used in war, but type of weapons used has been completely replaced. Development continues, even though development of swords as battle weapons as essentially ended. So they got Roman sword. They're going through Roman sword, and it goes into a different Anglo-Saxon sword, a Renaissance sword, a 20th century cavalry sword. End of military sword development is the ending point. Terminal negation refers to the end of a specific cycle of development. It shows the cycle of development of the sword, and then the ending of the sword altogether by bringing in pew-pews. Terminal negation is what happens when development completely ends for a given thing, phenomenon, or idea. For example, from one viewpoint, the development of a sword as weapons of war can be seen as having ended, having been terminally negated due to the innovation of firearms. In essence, swords are no longer developed nor implemented in modern warfare. Replacement negation and terminal negation must be considered in relative terms. From one viewpoint, we can see the rise of firearms as an underlying reason for the terminal negation of military use of swords. Today, no army on earth uses swords as primary battlefield weapons, and militaries no longer develop sword technology for battlefield use. However, from another viewpoint, the development of battlefield weapons has continued on long after the end of the primacy of swords, and it could be said that firearms have replaced swords as a primary battlefield weapon. Consider the death of a human being. From one perspective, death is a terminal negation. A person's consciousness has ended, and no further development of consciousness will occur for the individual. For other perspectives, development continues. The individual may have children who will continue their familial lineage. They may have contributed ideas which will continue to impact other people for centuries to come, and so on. In that sense, replacement negation may be viewed as dialectical negation. For example, someone studies modes of transportation in the history of the U.S. may see the process of steam locomotives replacing horses, and then cars replacing steam locomotives, as processes of dialectical negation from the outreaching prospect of the transportation system. Materials dialectics is concerned with all forms of negation but focuses primarily on dialectical negation. Therefore, materialist dialectics is not just a theory of transformation in general, but fundamentally a theory of development. All transformations is driven by negation. Development is a process, specifically of dialectical negation, which is a specific form of transformation in which an end of development creates the condition for new development, either through internal quality shifts or through replacement of some internal subject. Materialist dialectics is primary concern with dialectical negation, which drives development, because it is development which brings forth continuous change in our world. Terminal negation is and other forms of transformation which do not drive further development are the limited unity and can only represent certain limited viewpoints, i.e., the viewpoint of that which is terminated. From a broader perspective, nearly all terminations are replaced in some way or another by some other form of development. For instance, even when a person dies, although the consciousness of that person may terminate, there will be a continuous impact which will be carried forward from the diseased person's lifetime of consciousness, as well as a form of development which arises from the death itself. This dialectical definition of negation differs greatly from metaphysical conceptions of development, which are essentially viewed as terminal. From the metaphysical perspective, all things, phenomena, and idea are viewed as separate from one another. Therefore, negation are viewed as terminal processes, which brings development processes to their end. Here we go. This is metaphysical, I think. Yes, so you see, the hammer destroys the vase. Metaphysical perspective of terminal negation. The metaphysical perspective of terminal negation views negation as an essentially terminal process, representing the end point of the existence of a static and isolated thing, phenomenon, or idea. Thank you. In the above example, metaphysical frameworks would present smashing a vase with a hammer as a terminal negation from the perspective of the observer. Once the vase is smashed, the vase is considered no longer exists, and the broken shards are not considered to be a vase anymore. Materialist dialectics, on the other hand, views the shards as merely a development from the vase, a transition to the new stage of development. The negation was only terminal from the perspective of the vase itself. Excerpt from Vietnamese high school freshman civics education textbook. Wow. So, metaphysical and dialectical negation share one commonality. They both see development as a replacement of the old subject with a new subject. However, metaphysical negation happens when outside forces impact on a subject, deleting completely the existence of the old subject. According to this metaphysical perspective, the old subject and the new subject, which replaces it, do not have any connection. Dialectical negation fundamentally differs from metaphysical negation because it views development as a process of internal development. The dialectical negation does not view complete erasure or deletion of any form's subject. Instead, dialectical development sees the older subject, which is replaced, negated, as the premise or... Hold on a second. Hope I get this the first time. Where was I at? Negation does not view... Okay, dialectical development see the older subject, which is replaced, negated, as the premise or basis and of existence for the new subject. Comparison and examples. Metaphysical negation and dialectical negation. The earthquake destroyed the houses. That is metaphysical negation. Dialectical negation. The house was impacted by the external forces of an earthquake, which caused it to collapse. due to the internal characteristics of the house itself, which could not withstand the forces of the earthquake. The debris from the collapsed house will be cleared away and will continue to develop. The space where the house stood will also continue to develop in some way, with the earthquake and the resulting collapse serving as the basis of this further development. The water eroded mountains. Physical negation. Dialectical negation. The external forces of water caused erosion by transferring material away from the mountain due to the internal characteristics of the mountain's composite material. The water, the material which was washed away, and the mountain will all continue to develop. The erosion process will be the basis for this further development. That is, all right. The car has new tire because it ran over a nail. That is metaphysical. Now the dialectical. The external forces of the nail caused the tire to permanently deflate due to the initial characteristics of the tire, which could not withstand running over the nail. This served as the basis for further development. The old tire was removed and will be disposed of, which will serve as the basis for further development, i.e., the tire may be recycled and sent to the landfill. The removal of the tire serves as the basis for a further development of a new tire being installed. That is dialectical. When you add water, sunlight, and nutrition to a seed, it will grow into a plant. That's the metaphysical. Dialectical, they say, is the seed went through a process of negation as the sprout grew through various stages of development into a plant, facilitated by outside forces such as water, nutrition, sunlight, etc. The seed would not grow in isolation, as well as the internal characteristics and the seed itself. The seed serves as a basis of the sprout's development. The sprout then serves as the basis for the growth of the seedling, and the seedling serves as the basis for the growth of the fully grown plant. All of this development was driven by negation processes, as quantity shifts gradually lead to quality shifts through those various stages of development. As you can see from the examples shown, the metaphysical perspective focuses on external forces affecting a given subject and views every development process as terminal, with the beginning, middle, and end. The metaphysical perspective thus views negation as termination of a subject, and by extension of development. Materialist dialectics, on the other hand, views development as a continuous and never-ending process of mutual impact negation and further negation of each negation. The comprehensive and historical viewpoint must thus be sought to fully comprehend development and negation processes. So it sounds like you have to use historical materialism to understand where the process starts and where it's going to end. Dialectical negation has two basic characteristics: objectivity and inheritance. Dialectical negation is objective because negation arises from contradictions which exist between two opposite sides. These opposing sides may exist within a thing, phenomenon, or idea, but the opposing sides are still, by definition, externally opposed to one another from the perspective of either side. Though in any given negation, any given negation may be viewed as terminal from a certain perspective, of materialist dialectics is most concerned with processes of development wherein the end of one stage of development creates the condition for further development. Therefore, every development is simultaneously an internal and external process, depending on perspective. Development process may, from certain perspective, be seen as taking place within a subject and between two subjects, but they are always external, and therefore objective from the perspective of either opposing side, while simultaneously internal to the relationship. For example, the relationship between a husband and a wife may be seen as internal process of development of the marriage from the perspective of a marriage counselor. However, from their own perspective, each opposing side, i.e. the husband and the wife, see one another as external to each other. Therefore, the development of the marriage may be seen as an internal process, but the mutual impact and negation with which occur within the relationship are objective and external forces from the perspective of either opposing sides. This is important because it means that all development and all negations are essentially objective processes. Therefore, no entity has complete omniscient control over any development process. We must therefore understand that the nature of development and negation in order to be able to properly plan and affect change in our world. Dialectical negation is therefore the result of the process of resolving inevitable contradictions within a subject, i.e. a relationship itself. Dialectical negation allows for the old to be replaced by the new, therefore creating trends of development through dialectical negations as also self-negation. To reiterate, from the perspective of either opposing side, development is an external, objective process. From the perspective of the contradictory relationship, processes of development are internal processes of self-negation. Thus, dialectical negation is both an objective process which no entity can completely control, while simultaneously an internal process of self-negation and self-development. If two nations go to war, hello, haven't seen you in a while. Nice to see you. It's good to see you. You're probably already gone. Let's see where we're at. Hold on a second, I want to look at something. Remember 2:15, please. Mm. 2:15. Well, I can do 5 more pages, maybe. 2:15, right? 2:15. Am I on it? No, it's 2:16. All right, 2:15. Here we go. Up more. Sorry. If two nations go to war, either nation may view the war as an objective external development process, but from a wider perspective, external, the war is an internal development processes of the diplomatic relationship between the two warring nations. This is drastically different from the metaphysical perspective, which view any negation process as a purely external process of development wherein one subject is permanently deleted from existence, then replaced by another subject. From the metaphysical perspective, a war is simply a conflict between two distinct and separate nations, and the conclusion of the war is a terminal negation, which ends development of the war. From a materialist dialectic perspectives, on the other hand, the end of war would be seen as the basis of future development of the relationship between the two formerly warring nations. Dialectical negation also has a inheritance characteristic. When one opposing side negates another, the remaining side inherits factors from the negated side which are suitable with present conditions. Every negation process arises from contradictions between two opposing sides. Within any such negation process, we can think of one side as negator and the other side as negated. Negation will like all relational processes, lead to mutual impacts between both sides. Therefore, the negated will impact the negator. In other words, the negated side will be somehow reflected in the negator. This means that the negator will inherit and carry forward certain attributes, factors, and characteristics which in receives from the negated side. Again, consider a war between two nations. Even if one nation completely conquers and subjugates the other in total victory, the victorious nation will still inherit certain factors from the defeated nation. Which factors are inherited will depend on the conditions. The victorious nation may pick up some cultural aspects from the defeated nation, such as cuisine, fashion, etc. They may incorporate tactics and strategies which they observed the defeated enemy using on the battlefield, and so on. The point is that the victorious nation will be impacted in some way by the defeated nation. The factors which are adopted will be suitable within the present condition. Take, for example, a car breaking down due to engine failure. This can be seen as an opposing relationship between the car itself and the car owner. If the present conditions are suitable, i.e., the owner has the funds and resources available and the desire to repair the car, then the car may be repaired and continue operating for years to come. If, on the other hand, conditions aren't suitable, i.e., the owner does not have the funds nor the resources, or the owner no longer wants the car, then the car may be sent to the scrapyard. As another example, if a fox eats a rabbit, it will inherit certain characteristics from the rabbit. It will inherit nutrition from the rabbit's body. It may also inherit other characteristics such as a disease the rabbit was carrying, if the conditions of the fox biological composition are suitable, if the disease can be transferred from the rabbit to the fox. Dialectical negation is not a complete negation, i.e. deletion, of the old. Rather, dialectical negation is a continuity of growth in which the old develops into the new, a process of dialectical negation. The new forms and develops on its own. Through the process of filtering out unsuitable factors while retaining suitable content, Vladimir Lenin describes dialectical negation as, quote, not empty negation, not futile negation, not skeptical negation, vacillation and doubt is characteristic and essential in dialectics, which undoubtedly contains the element of negation, and indeed it is most important element. No, but negation as a moment of connection, as a moment of development, retains a positive, i.e., without any vacillation, without any eclecticism. The passage from Lenin above comes from Clemency Dut's popular English translation of one of Lenin's notebooks. But below is our translation from the Vietnamese version of this text, from the original text of this book, which we hope might be somewhat easier to understand. Dialectical negation is not empty negation. It is not negation without any thoughts. It's not skeptical negation. It's not hesitation. Skepticism is not a feature of the essence of the dialectics. Of course, dialectics include the negative. It even plays as one of the important factors of a given subject. No, it is negation as the movement of development. Dialectical negation retains a positive meaning. There is no hesitation. There is no eclecticism. In order to understand what Lenin is saying here, we should first understand what Lenin is responding to. The above notes are referred to the chapter title, quote, The Absolute Ideal, within Hegel's Science of Logic. In this chapter, Hegel recounts various critiques of dialectics and counters them. Skepticism here refers to the tendency to address all human knowledge with doubt. Philosophical skepticism never moves past two questions. One, oh shit, is this knowledge true? Two, will human beings ever obtain true knowledge? Skeptics of this nature engage in a sort of metaphysical inquisition in which every thesis, that is, every encountered, is immediately and utterly refuted and thus negated in a metaphysical sense of termination. Eclecticism, I gotta get Joe back up here, refers to philosophical and ideological conceptions which draw from a variety of theories, styles, and ideas in an unsystematic manner. Lenin contends that dialectical negation is non-eclecticist because it raises above mere rhetorical combativeness and total negation. This concept is okay, right. With all this in mind, we see that Lenin is refuting the notion that dialectics are and can only be negative in nature. A metaphysical skeptic conception of dialectics holds that negation takes the form of rhetorical arguing and refutation, in which one idea is presented and a second idea is offered to counter the first idea, which completely and totally negates the first idea. According to this argument, dialectics is, therefore, a totally negative process. And here we go. Welcome back, Joe. Thesis, antithesis. Looks like they fight with each other. Thesis is negated in antithesis and then synthesized. Accurately, full negative view of dialectics. A common misperception of dialectical development is that it is fully negative, insomuch as the initial thesis, initial subject, is completely negated by the antithesis impacting subject. In fact, characteristics from both of the thesis and antithesis are carried forward into synthesis. Thank you, Joe. This chapter from the Science of Logic, which Lenin is responding to in the reference text, Hegel is arguing that the conception of dialectics is only negative, i.e., a system of thinking is which encounter arguments are presented to completely negate initial arguments is inaccurate. Hegel explains that when one opposing side negates another, it thereafter contains a general and determination of first opposing side within itself. In other words, after one opposing side negates another, it retains features and aspects from the opposing side which was negated. Lenin found this particular point to be so important that he wrote, quote, "This is very important for understanding dialectics," in the margin of his textbook. The reason both Hegel and Lenin found this idea, that the negator contains elements of the negated after negation, is that this counters the accusation of dialectics are only negative. This is why Lenin's notebook highlight the importance of the negator retaining the positive after negation. Lenin is pointing out the importance of the retention of features of the negated and the negator, because it is this retention which prevents dialectical development from becoming a purely negative process. Thesis, antithesis negates synthesis. Accurate retention view of dialectics. The materialist dialectics is understood that negation is a process of retention. Characteristics from both the synthesis, initial subject, and the antithesis, impact subject, are retained in the resulting synthesis. We must also understand that Lenin's means when he refers to skepticism in his notes. Lenin here is referring to the philosophical view that we can never know whether or not our beliefs are true. This belief is popularly known as mechanism or empirical-criticism in Lenin's time. A common critique of dialectics is, we're almost done, is that it is inherently skeptical system of thought, since dialectics is seen as a process of presenting counter arguments to suppositional arguments. Lenin, in his notebook, presents the idea that such skepticism is not a feature of dialectics, precisely because nothing is ever completely, totally, and entirely negated. In other words, the accusation of dialectical analysis is essentially skeptical, is rooted in the mistaken notion that one opposing side, i.e., the counter argument, completely negates the original supposition. In fact, according to materialist dialectics, the negator always retains features of aspects from the negated side, which counters this critique. Thus, dialectical development, which occurs through dialectical negation, is a process of forward motion, not a process of vacillating back and forth from one position to another. And there is no skeptical hesitation preventing forward progress. This same idea that the negator retains features of the negated also counters another common critique of materialist dialectics, that dialectical analysis is simply a system of rhetorical sophistry and eclecticism. Eclecticism is a conceptual approach that is completely unsystematic, drawing from a variety of theories, styles, and ideas without a cohesive and all-encompassing philosophical framework. Some critics claim that dialectics must be eclecticist and sophistic in nature. These critics claim that dialectics is simply rhetorical disputation, in which any given supposition is countered argued, and that this countered argument is negation. Materialist dialectics defines negation as one contradiction side taking over the other while retaining traces of characteristics from the negated side. It is in no way simply an act of rhetorical dispute or refutation. In summary, materialist dialectics upholds that nothing is ever completely and utterly deleted or erased from existence through negation. Instead, any time one opposing side negates another, aspects of the negated side is inherited by the negated side. Note, the reference here is Hegel's passage, which Lenin is referring to from Science and Logic in the cited notes above. A universal first considered in and for itself shows itself to be the other of itself. Taken quite generally, this determination can be taken to mean that what is at first immediate now appears as mediated, related to an other, or that the universal appears as a particular. Hence, the second term that has thereby come into being is the negative and of the first. And if we anticipate the subsequent process, the first negative, the immediate from the negative side has been exhausted in the other, but the other is essentially not the empty negative and the nothing that is taken to be the usual result of dialectics. Rather, it is the other of the first, the negative of the immediate of the immediate. It is therefore determined as the mediated, contains in general the determination of the first within itself. Consequently, the first is essentially preserved and retained even in the other, to hold fast the positive in its negative and the content of the presupposition. And the result is the most important part of rational cognition. Also, only the simplest reflection is needed to furnish conviction of the absolute truth and the necessity of this requirement, while with regard to the example of proofs, the whole of logic consists of these. Therefore, dialectical negation is inevitable, is an inevitable tendency of the progression of the inner relationship between the old and the new. It is the self-driving, assertive force of all motion and development of all things, phenomena, and ideas. Hold on a second. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we're gonna do, this is the last page. So you wanna go ahead and We'll get there. Negation, B, negation of the negation. In the perpetual movement of material world, dialectical negation is an exhaustible process. It creates a development tendency of things from lower level to higher level, taking place in a cyclical manner, in the form of a spiral. The concept of the spiral from the development of a dialectical materialist philosophy stands in contrast to the metaphysical concepts of linear development. Metaphysical conception of linear development. The metaphysical viewpoint holds that development is more or less a straight line. As one subject is negated, it is replaced by another. This subject will be then negated by another, and so on, in what is essentially conceived as a straight line of development. As you see, metaphysical development, they have a raw aluminum, like the mineral, and completely replaced by a soda can. Even though the soda can has aluminum in it, which is the essence of the element, right? So yeah, soda can replaced by recycled aluminum. Again, the aluminum's still present. The metaphysical line development model sees an initial form of being replaced, of entirely negated into a complete distinct entity. In the above example, metaphysical line developed simply see raw aluminum as being negated and replaced in the real world. Once the aluminum can is created, the raw aluminum as a metaphysical entity is considered no longer to exist. Likewise, when the soda can is transformed into recycled aluminum, the can is considered replaced, and is no longer considered to have any metaphysical existence, which is incorrect. This is all incorrect. This concept of metaphysical line developed directly contradictions of materialist dialectical conceptions of historical viewpoint. And right there, we're going to stop where it says dialectical materialism, materialist conceptions of development. I think it's a good time to stop because I probably have a lot of notes. And let me do my bookmark.
I do, but
it's
already 8 o'clock.
It's okay. We can go a little over. Why?
I have about 30 minutes of notes.
30 minutes of notes?
Yeah, you read a lot.
I only read, let's see here. Okay. Let me go get my thing real quick. Let me get my headset on.
The top of page 220, Lynn.
I'm page 220. So that way we don't have any echoing. All right, go ahead, Joe.
Okay, let me add a bookmark. Get rid of this bookmark. Go to here. Okay, so we started at the law of unification and contradiction between opposites.
Mm-hmm.
The law of unification and contradiction between opposites is the essence of dialectics. Contradiction, defined further in the next section, is the force which serves as the fundamental, originating, and universal force which drives all motion and development of all things, phenomena, and ideas. Contradiction is a fundamental driving force because it is the most basic driving force which all other forms of motion and development are based upon. Contradiction is the originating driving force because all motion and development arises from contradiction. Contradiction is the universal driving force because all things, phenomena, and ideas, without exception, are driven to motion and development by contradictions. Then we went into the definition of contradiction and common characteristics of contradiction. A contradiction is, fundamentally, just a type of relationship. In a contradictory relationship, two things, phenomena, and or ideas mutually impact one another, resulting in the eventual negation of one subject and the synthesis of the negator and the negated into some new form. And if you remember, there was a picture of a fox, a bunny, and then there's just a fox that was no longer hungry. Um, Materialist dialectical contradiction recognizes that every contradiction is defined by the relationship between the negated and the negator. Materialist dialectics also recognizes that attributes and characteristics of the negated subject are carried forward into the synthesized subject. Materialist dialectics also recognizes that contradiction continually, indefinitely, as the negated becomes negated again, and so on continuously forever. Contradiction arises from opposition, which exists within or between things, phenomena, and ideas. The concept of opposing quote unquote sides refers to such aspects, properties, and tendencies of motion which oppose one another, yet are simultaneously conditions and premises of the existence of one another. Examples include negative charge and positive charge within atoms, anabolism and catabolism within living organisms. Anabolism refers to the growth and building up of molecules within an organism, while catabolism refers to the digestion and breaking down of molecules within an organism. Production and consumption as socioeconomic activities, trial and error, which leads to cognitive development. Then we went on the general properties of contradictions. And contradictions is objective and universal. Conscious motion and development are also rooted in contradictory forces. Engels points out the contradiction between humanity's seemingly infinite capacity for learning with the seemingly infinite amount of knowledge which can be obtained in the world. This great contradiction drives a seemingly endless process of expanding human knowledge collectively over countless generations. Contradictions are not only objective and universal, but also diverse and plentiful. The diverse nature of contradictions is evident in the fact that every subject can include many different contradictions, and that contradictions manifest differently depending upon specific conditions. Contradictions can hold different positions and roles in the existence, motion, and development of things, phenomena, and ideas. These positions and roles include, but are not limited to, internal and external contradictions, fundamental and non-fundamental contradictions, primary and secondary contradictions. Internal contradictions are contradictions which exist in the internal relations of a subject, while external contradictions exist between two or more subjects as external relations. A fundamental contradiction is a contradiction which defines the essence of a relationship. A non-fundamental contradiction exists in only one aspect or attribute of a thing, phenomena, or idea. A non-fundamental contradiction can impact a subject, but it will not control or decide the essential development of the subject. Whether or not a contradiction is fundamental is relative to the point of view. In the development of things, phenomena, and ideas, there are many development stages. In each stage of development, there will be one contradiction which drives the development process. This is what we call the primary contradiction. Secondary contradictions include all the other contradictions which exist during that stage of development. Determining whether a contradiction is primary or secondary is relative. It depends heavily upon the material conditions and the situation. Every material condition and situation is different. A secondary contradiction may become the primary contradiction. Within all the various fields of inquiry, There exist contradictions which have a diverse range of different properties and characteristics. Different fields of study will focus on different forms of contradictions, and any given thing, phenomena, or idea may contain countless contradictions which can be analyzed and considered for different purposes. All of these various methods of analysis may focus on specific forms of contradictions though there will be overlap. And if you haven't read it yet, but Mao's On Contradiction would also help give you a basis to help with understanding this. Motion process of contradictions. In every contradiction, the opposing sides are united with each other and opposed to each other at the same time. The concept of unity between opposites refers to the fact that a contradiction is a binding, inseparable, and mutually impacting relationship which exists between opposites. Contradictions are binding and inseparable because they hold a relationship together. If two opposing things, phenomena, or ideas simply separate, then contradiction, by definition, no longer exists. Contradictions are said to be mutually impacting because any time a contradiction exists between two opposing sides, both sides are mutually impacted for as long as the contradiction exists and develops. Of course, it is possible for two opposing sides to separate from one another. We see that production and consumption can't be separated from one another without leading to a change in the essential nature of the relationship and the opposing subjects. And we see that the opposing sides mutually impact one another. A change in consumption will affect production and vice versa. In any given contradiction, in any given contradictory relationship, each oppositional side is the premise for the other's existence. Unity among opposites also defines the identity of each opposing side. Identity and unity are, more or less, the same concept when it comes to understanding the nature of contradiction between opposites. In material processes of nature, social processes, and processes of consciousness, we perceive and define oppositional forces by recognizing mutually exclusive and contradictory tendencies within and between things, phenomena, and ideas. In other words, whenever we think of an oppositional relationship, we define it in terms of the opposition. In other words, the identity of contradictory relationships is defined by the unity of the opposing sides with one another. The concept struggle of opposites refers to the tendency of opposites to eliminate and negate each other. There exist many diverse forms of struggle between opposites. Struggle can manifest in various forms based on the nature of the given thing, phenomena, or idea. Relationships within a thing, phenomenon, or idea, or between things, phenomena, and ideas. Specific material conditions. The process of unity and struggle of opposites inevitably leads to a transformation between them. The transformation between opposites takes place with rich diversity, and such transformations can vary depending on the properties of the opposite sides as well as specific material conditions. Opposing sides, by definition, oppose one another. If forces or characteristics which exist within or between things, phenomena, or ideas do not oppose one another, then they are not, by definition, opposites. Thus, it can be understood that opposing sides have a tendency to struggle against one another. It is this very struggle which defines two sides as opposites and as contradictory. Indeed, no equilibrium of contradictory forces can be permanent. Eventually, one opposing side will overtake the other, and eventually, any given contradiction will result in one opposing side overcoming the other. Uh, According to the law of unification and contradiction between opposites, the struggle between two opposing sides is absolute, while the struggle between them is relative, conditional, and temporary. In unity, there is a struggle in unity. Absolute and relative are philosophical classifications which refer to interdependence. That which is absolute exists independently and with permanence. That which is relative is temporary and dependent on other conditions or circumstances in order to exist. Opposition to considered absolute Opposition is considered absolute because it is opposition which drives motion and change in all things, phenomena, and ideas through contradictory processes of opposing sides. We must understand that in materialist dialectics, the absolute and the relative exist within one another. In other words, the absolute and the relative have a dialectical relationship with one another in all things, phenomena, and ideas. Relative unity refers to the nature of unity between contradictory subjects. Contradictory subjects are unified in the sense that any given contradiction is essentially defined by the contradiction between two subjects. Thus, two subjects are unified in contradiction. However, this unity is relative in the sense that this unification is temporary. The unity will end upon negation and synthesis and relative, i.e., defined by the relationship between the two contradicting subjects. Absolute struggle refers to the fact that contradiction, negation, and synthesis will go on forever. In this sense, contradictory processes are absolute because such struggles exist permanently. Struggle has no set beginning or end point and exists independently of any specific thing, phenomena, or idea. The relative unity and the absolute struggle between opposing sides have a dialectical relationship with one another. The permanent absoluteness of struggle, the fact that all things, phenomena, and ideas are constantly undergoing processes of change through contradictory forces, can only manifest in the relative unity of opposing sides, which can only exist through the temporary existence of conditional relations between opposing sides. Then, let's see. As old contradictions disappear, new contradictions are formed, and the process of mutual impact and transformation between opposites continues, which drives the motion and development of all things, phenomena, and ideas. The relationship, impact, and transformation between opposites are the source and driving force of all movement and development in the world. Any given process of development, that is to say, of transformation or motion, can be seen as a struggle between opposites. Various forms of struggle can exist simultaneously for any given subject, and the way we interpret struggle can depend on our point of view. Materialist dialectics require us to identify, examine, and understand the opposing forces which drive all development in our universe. Only through understanding such contradictions can we intercede and effect changes in the world which suit our purposes. Okay, then we went on to meaning of the methodology. Given that contradictions are objective and universal, and that they are the source and driving force of movement and development, it is therefore necessary to detect, recognize, and understand contradictions, to fully analyze opposing sides, and to grasp the nature, origin, and tendencies of motion and development in our awareness and practice. In other words, materialist dialectics is simply a system of understanding the world around us by viewing all things, phenomena, and ideas as collections of relationships and contradictions which exist within and between all things, phenomena, and ideas. Such contradictions exist with such rich diversity, it is necessary to have a historical point of view. The historical viewpoint is vital because, in order to fully understand any given contradiction, we must understand the process of development which led to its formation. It is vital to know the history of development of a given pair of opposing sides, as well as the characteristics and other properties of both opposing sides to fully understand the contradiction. Since all conscious activity, like all processes of motion and change, ultimately derives from the driving force of contradiction, it is vital for us to develop a historical and comprehensive perspective of any contradiction we hope to effect through our conscious activities. And then we went into the law of the negation of negation. The law of negation describes the fundamental and universal tendency of movement and the development to occur through dialectical negation, forming a cyclical form of development through what is termed negation of negation. Negation refers to any act of motion or transformation which arises from contradiction. Specifically, negation is what occurs when one opposing side completely overcomes the other. Nothing in our universe can transform or move all by itself without any contradiction. Thus, negation drives all development and motion of all things, phenomena, and ideas. There are various forms of negation, and the same negation process may be seen to take different forms depending on viewpoint of analysis. Replacement negation occurs when one thing, phenomena, or idea takes the place of another. Replacement negation is always a dialectical process where one subject is replaced gradually by another. Replacement may be relatively fast or slow, but it is never instantaneous. Nothing can pop in and out of existence instantaneously. Terminal negation is what happens when development completely ends for a given thing, phenomena, or idea. Replacement negation and terminal negation must be considered in relative terms. Okay. Materialist dialectics is concerned with all forms of negation, but focuses primarily on dialectical negation. Therefore, materialist dialectics is not just a theory of transformation in general, but fundamentally a theory of development. All transformation is driven by negation. Development is a process, specifically of dialectical negation, which is a specific form of transformation in which an end of development creates the conditions for new development, either through internal quality shifts or through replacement by some external subject. Materialist dialectics is primarily concerned with dialectical negation, which drives development, because it is development, which brings forth continuous change in our world. Terminal negotiations and other forms of transformation which do not drive further development are of limited unity and can only represent certain limited viewpoints. And then I thought this was really important. It was an excerpt from Vietnam's high school freshman civic education textbook. Let me take a sip of my drink. Metaphysical and dialectical negation share one commonality. They both see development as the replacement of an old subject with a new subject. However, metaphysical negation happens when outside forces impact on a subject, deleting completely the existence of the old subject. According to this metaphysical perspective, the old subject and the new subject which replaces it, do not have any connection. Dialectical negation fundamentally differs from metaphysical negation because it views development as a process of internal development. Dialectical negation does not view complete erasure or deletion of any former subject. Instead, dialectical development sees the older subject, which is replaced or negated, as the premise or basis of existence for the new subject. The metaphysical perspective focuses on external forces affecting a given subject and views every development process as terminal with a beginning, middle, and end. I need to take a break, but that's good enough. After that, we were pretty much caught up, right?
All right, thank you. Doodley, would you like to add?
I don't feel like there's something I can add to add context. I just want to say that it was a good read, and thank you for reading it.
You have nothing that you want that hits you, anything that you want to talk about? It's okay if you don't. It's fine. But it sounds like they covered it, huh? No questions? No, everybody has any questions? Anybody wants to come up and ask any questions at all? Doesn't look like no one wants to come up and ask questions. All right then. Since we don't have no one else have any other questions and stuff that wants to come up and ask and stuff, I'll go ahead and close it out, everybody. I appreciate you. All right. Wish you all well.
All right. See you later.